Do you want to know more about how you can eat for better health and longevity, and how your diet and lifestyle can play a part in chronic disease? Then you're in the right place. I'm Claire Day.
And I'm Daisy Lund, and we are both plant-based doctors with a passion for improving nutritional education. In this podcast, we will bring you all the latest medical evidence on how a plant-based diet can improve your health whilst being kinder to the planet and fairer to the animals that we share it with.
Twice a month, we bring you interviews from experts in the field with a focus on an important topic related to plant-based health, all while sharing recipes and food ideas.
So, welcome to, in a nutshell, the Plant-Based Health Professionals podcast.
Okay, we're welcoming Josh Gibbs to the podcast today. Josh graduated from the University of Warwick with a BSc in Biomedical Sciences and an MA in Social Science Research. He's now doing research, writing scientific papers and articles, and is working towards a PhD entitled, "Should the UK go plant-based to support its green recovery?" Josh is an ideal nutshell guest as he is interested in all things plant-based, ranging from health benefits and concerns to environmental sustainability to developments in meat alternatives. He gained notability when he showed that plant-based diets could lower blood pressure, even when they contained some animal products, and when he found that replacing meat with plant-based meat alternatives could reduce heart attack risk by lowering LDL cholesterol. His latest research is looking at the links between the consumption of plant-based meat alternatives and psychological well-being.
We heard Josh speaking this year at the VegMed conference in London and found his research into plant-based meat alternatives really fascinating. So we're delighted that he's here today to join us and share his work and expertise. Welcome, Josh. We've been looking forward to speaking with you on the podcast for weeks, so it's great to have you on. And before we go into your work and your research, can you tell us a bit more about yourself and how you came to being plant-based?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. That was a lovely introduction. And so as a child, I suffered with chronic migraines, and I was sort of missing time off school every week. It was awful, and I'd be out of action for days. Just pain, I'd lose my vision, I couldn't speak, it was awful. And I got to 17 years old and I was on all kinds of medications, and the impacts of that on my sort of like mood and social life was just not great. And I just reached a sort of tipping point where I couldn't take it anymore. So I was like, I need to do something. And I did some research online, and I came across a study by Dr. Neil Barnard and colleagues, where they were looking at people who suffered with chronic migraines and the impact of a low-fat vegan diet on their symptoms. And what they found was a significant improvement in people's pain tolerance compared to people taking a sham supplement. And it was a staggering difference. And they also showed improvements in pain, intensity of migraines, frequency. And so overnight, I went vegan. And after a year, I had no migraines, completely in remission. And at that point, I was just amazed at how much diet can impact your health. And that really sparked my interest for this topic, because then I was like, okay, if it works for migraines, what else can this help? So I went off to university to study Biomedical Sciences. And in my first year, I conducted my first research project. I managed to get a little bit of funding. I approached a very eminent name in the cardiovascular disease medicine, Professor Francesco Capuccio. He has had massive involvement in sort of determining that salt raises blood pressure, and has influence policy all around the world for global salt reduction. So he was the guy to go to get involved with nutrition science. And so my first paper, I was looking at the effects of plant-based diets on blood pressure. And I didn't want to just look at vegan, vegetarian diets. So I looked at a broad spectrum. So including like the Mediterranean diet, healthy Nordic diet, the DASH diet. And what we found was that you can get significant reductions in systolic and diastolic blood pressure even with these plant-based diets with some meat. And if you were to apply the reduction, so we saw around a 5 millimeters of mercury reduction in systolic blood pressure with like the lacto-vegetarian diet and the DASH diet. If you were to apply that to the UK population, you'd reduce the prevalence of hypertension by 50%. And that in turn would result in a 7% reduction in all-cause mortality, a 9% reduction in coronary heart disease related mortality, and 14% reduction in stroke mortality. So that is just an idea of how big of an impact eating more plants can have on our health. And I was really sold at that point that this is the way to be eating. And so I did some more studies looking at it. I then looked at cholesterol, and same again, significant reductions in LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol that causes clogs in your arteries and results in cardiovascular disease. And then I took a step back from the research, because it just seemed that everywhere I was looking, when I was reading the literature, everyone was saying the same thing: eat more plants, eat less meat. And it was becoming incredibly uncontroversial to sort of have that opinion, but no one's doing it. So I started thinking, like, how realistic is it to get people to eat lentils in this food environment when it's fast food, it's junk food, it's Burger King, it's McDonald's? And I figured only a very small percentage of people are going to be willing to make that switch, or even if they are willing, they're not going to be in the right sort of socioeconomic, demographic position to be able to do it. And that got me thinking, right, how about plant-based meats? That's got to be a much more sort of easy and achievable switch than a burger to lentils. A burger to a plant-based burger, I think that's more doable, especially when they're progressing so much and becoming more and more like their meat counterparts every year. And this philosophy and way of looking at it is incredibly involved in public health. So there's this concept of efficacy versus effectiveness. So efficacy is showing that something works in a trial. So you've got an incredibly controlled environment where you're essentially controlling everything someone eats, and then you'll see improvements in their blood pressure, cholesterol, whatever you're looking at. But that doesn't mean if you tell people to do that in the free living world that you'll see the same effects, because, as I mentioned, the food environment is incredibly toxic, and there's just a plethora of barriers that prevent people from eating this way. So you don't get the effectiveness, you don't get that public health effect, because it's just not an achievable intervention. So yeah, this is where I've sort of ended up at plant-based meats, investigating them, because I see them as a more achievable route to reaching more healthy, sustainable diets. And I will admit that they are not as healthy as whole plant-based foods, but my research is showing they are healthier than the alternative, which is standard meat.
That's fascinating, Josh, and we'll get into the detail of that in a second. But I think, Claire, you wanted to ask Josh just to clarify what plant-based meats actually were, didn't you?
Yeah, so we're going to talk to you about meat substitutes from textured soya protein through to the mycoprotein to whatever it is that they make Beyond Burger from. And we wondered if you could tell us more about the differences in these foods, and something you've already touched on, which is what are the barriers to people switching from meat to eating more of these?
Okay, yeah, so I'm not a food scientist, but from what I've read, essentially these plant-based meats are made from protein isolates from a range of different plants. So in my study, the control trials used ones derived from soy, wheat, peanut, and pea proteins. And what they will do is they will go through various processing methods and extrude them into meat-like products. And so you have the differences there in terms of the base ingredient. And we don't have any studies yet sort of pitting those different ingredients head to head. So are wheat plant-based meat alternatives healthier than soy or pea or peanut? We don't have that study yet. But if I sort of had to hedge my bets and guess which would be the healthier options, I would go towards the soy-based ones because of the presence of phytoestrogens, which we have a long track record of them reducing LDL cholesterol. And that's why you see soy products implemented in diets like the Portfolio diet, developed by Dr. David Jenkins, which is a diet that was basically designed to lower cholesterol. And it's also why soy is also mentioned in the Canadian food guidelines. Yeah, so there's that variation in terms of the base ingredients, but then you also have this broad spectrum of the amount of processing these products go through. So you have the very limited processed ones like textured vegetable protein, which is literally soy flour that is just extruded into little sort of meat chunks. And mycoprotein is very similar as well. And mycoprotein, for those of you that don't know, is a protein that is derived from a fungi, and it's very high in fiber. And there's some evidence that it may have a sort of high content of beta-glucan, which is a type of fiber that has been shown to reduce blood pressure, and it's present in oats, and that's why they're so healthy. Yeah, so they are on the lower process end of the spectrum. But then you have your Beyond Burgers and your Impossible Meat on the other side of the spectrum, which have a lot more additives. They've got salt, the coconut oil, and then the different types of preservatives as well that they use. So it is very heterogeneous. So what that means is there's just a lot of variety within these products, which is one of the limitations of lumping them all together and seeing what their effect is on health, because they likely have variation between them.
Yeah, thanks. So there seems to be such a variety of these foods that surely there would be something that somebody would like, but yet still we don't find people taking up them as an alternative to meat. So when you were looking at it from the social science point of view, what do you think the barriers are to people switching at the moment?
Yeah, so we don't have many studies specifically looking at the barriers to plant-based meats, but we have studies looking at the barriers to plant-based diets in general, which often people see that as involving plant-based meats. And number one is always taste. And we are now getting to a point where these plant-based meats, for some of them, like the Impossible Burgers, we don't have them in the UK yet, but they are indistinguishable from real beef burgers. And I have friends, I've also an academic partner in Singapore, and they have all of the Impossible products there. They're really far ahead in this area. And they were a carnivore, massive meat eater. And I had a discussion with them, and they were like, okay, I'm going to try one. And they were converted. They absolutely love them. They only eat Impossible Burgers now. They don't even like beef burgers. They think the Impossible Burger is nicer. But the problem with these products is they're incredibly expensive, and they're only available to people that are in the upper percentiles of earnings. So you would hope that with time, you'd get scale of production and these products would reduce in price. And something that I would love to see, and part of sort of my PhD, is looking at policy and like what the government can do to make these products more accessible and affordable. So maybe you'd look at subsidizing these foods. We currently subsidize the production of meat and dairy in this country. Why don't we do it for plant-based meats, which are more sustainable? But it is an investment as well, because these products are growing. Their occupation of the market is growing. And by not getting into it early, our government is really missing out. But yeah, so you've got taste as the main barrier, and then cost, as I've just mentioned. And then you've also got more broad social views. So like masculinity, that's a massive barrier for men. And it seems that women are much more open to trying plant-based diets and going plant-based and eating less meat. You also have just the fact that people think meat is healthy and that they need it for protein and vitamins and minerals, which obviously we know isn't the case. You can get all of that from a healthy, balanced plant-based diet. So yeah, I guess what we need is education, and also get these products just more affordable and accessible.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's interesting you said about the Singapore connection there, because of course, a lot of our listeners will have seen the Dan Buettner documentary, where they actually highlight that public policy measure in Singapore that they subsidize brown rice, so that when you have a takeaway, you opt for the whole grain rather than the white rice. I'm going to change tack a bit here, because since we've got someone who's an academic, we thought it was a good opportunity to unpack some of the ways that the research is done. So I'm going to ask you quite a technical question and say, can you explain more about how the systematic reviews and meta-analyses work, and why they are so important when we research the effects of diets? Because what we noticed when we were reading your papers was that you seem to start with a lot of studies, hundreds of them in fact, that looked like they could be really relevant to what we're trying to find out more about, but then you end up getting down to a much smaller number for the actual research paper that you come up with. So how do you do that?
Right, so to answer this question, I performed a systematic review and meta-analysis. And what that essentially entails is doing a massive database search for all of the studies that are answering the same research question of what is the impact of plant-based meats and mycoprotein-based meats on cardiometabolic risk factors. And so initially you just get thousands of studies, and you have to go through each one, screen them to check whether they are eligible to be included in your study. And so a lot of them you can disregard because they're answering sort of different things or they're not quite what you want. But then some of them look like they are sort of perfect for answering your research question. Then you have to go through and read the whole paper. And you'll often find that maybe they weren't just looking at adding plant-based meats to the diet. They were also adding in sort of like an exercise regime. And you have to disregard those studies for this research question because there's no way of separating whether it was the plant-based meats or whether it was the exercise that was having this beneficial effect. So then you cut down your studies quite significantly after this process. And so in total, I ended up with 12 studies and there were 15 papers addressing the effect of meat alternatives on cardiometabolic risk factors. And so we looked at a range of different risk factors: total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, fasting blood glucose, the two types of blood pressure, systolic and diastolic, and then weight. And what we found was significant reductions in total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. There were no significant changes in the other risk factors. Now, the reduction we saw in LDL cholesterol, which is really the important risk factor here for cardiovascular disease risk, we saw around a 0.4 millimole per litre reduction. And if you look to the literature to see the public health impact of reductions of that scale caused by like statins, we have lots of strong evidence there and rigorous studies. And so, if you look at 0.5 millimole reductions, they're associated with around a 20% reduction in ischemic heart disease events and a 25% lower risk of coronary heart disease over 2 years. So you would expect the impact to be within the same ballpark, assuming that these effects last over a longer duration than the studied period, which often is only a couple of weeks, sort of 12 weeks, maybe longer if you're lucky.
So tell us more on the potential mechanisms for that and public health implications.
Potential mechanisms, I believe that it is mostly due to having a sort of total dietary reduction of saturated fat. Now, we have studies showing, I actually have a colleague at the University of Warwick who's also doing a PhD called Alice, and she's recently published a paper where she analysed different plant-based products just in UK supermarkets compared to their animal-based counterparts, so sausages, bacon, chicken nuggets, etc. And what she found was that the plant-based products had significantly lower saturated fat, significantly more fibre, and interestingly, there wasn't a significant difference in like the salt levels. So that would explain maybe why we didn't see a reduction in blood pressure here, but in my previous research, I did find a reduction in blood pressure from plant-based diets. But so I would say it's mostly the effects are coming from this reduction in LDL cholesterol. But there are also other potential mechanisms. So you have the fact that there's no trans fats or cholesterol in plant-based meats. Now, these impacts of these on blood cholesterol levels aren't as great as saturated fat intake, but they may play a slight role. And then you also have fiber. Normal meat doesn't contain any fiber. Well, but some of these plant-based products they're loaded with fiber, and so fiber can via the gut microbiome facilitate reductions in cholesterol and just promote a healthy gut. And also, if we're looking at sort of the soy products again, you've got the phytoestrogens, which we know have a unique property of lowering LDL cholesterol. And so that could also be influencing there.
I'm so fascinated by this because I just think it has such huge public health implications, given that cardiovascular disease is our number one leading cause of death in the Western world. Could you elaborate a little bit on your findings with regards to the health implications?
So, I think I mentioned, so if you were to apply this reduction that we observed to the population, you would see a reduction of around 20% in ischemic heart disease or events and a 25% lower risk of coronary heart disease over 2 years. So that is massive. And you think about the savings in like social care and health spend that could be put elsewhere, that could go to sustainability, sort of like rewilding. It could go to any other part of society that needs money. But instead it's being wasted treating people that are ill that don't need to be ill. So massive impacts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we were talking a little bit before we came online, me and Daisy, about conflicts of interest and the whole thing about, how you actually get governments to change what they're doing, what's happening with industry. And I think it's fair to say that you've got no conflicts of interest in your research, or at least I haven't seen you declare any in your papers. But that doesn't seem to be the case for all the research projects that you've actually looked at. And you even highlighted in one of your papers that 33%, so a third of the studies that were included, had a high risk of funding bias, for example. Have you made any observations of any particular problems with conflicts of interest in the food industry?
So conflicts of interest is a really interesting one, because everyone has conflicts of interest. But when we are talking about studies, it's usually a financial conflict of interest. So I am a vegan, and ultimately that will bias my worldview, as would it if I was a meat eater. That would bias my worldview, and I would look at things in a certain way. And so as someone that aspires for research excellence, I practice a thing called reflexivity. So it's all about taking a step back from your research and reflecting upon how you as a person and how you've experienced this world impacts your choice of study design, the methods, your interpretation of your findings, and all of these things to try and figure out, am I doing that because I'm vegan and I want this to look good? Or am I doing this because this is the proper scientific method and this is rigorous science that can be trusted? And so I think I've proved that my bias hasn't influenced my research because, for example, if you look at my first study where I was looking at the different types of plant-based diets, it was actually the ones that contained some meat that were better. The vegan diet didn't significantly reduce blood pressure. So I could have tainted that research. I could have gone, let's just exclude this one study, and that may have made it statistically significant. So, and that's the sort of tricks that people that are funded by industry sometimes use. Now, not all research funded by industry is bad and can't be trusted. A lot of it is very trustworthy research, and you just have to know what you're looking for. If sound sort of study design and methodology has been put in place, some of the best studies I've read are industry funded. And the thing is, as researchers, there is a very limited pot of resources to do research. And a lot of questions need that industry funding to actually be answered. And so an example is the swap meat trial that Christopher Gardner, acclaimed nutrition researcher, who I would say doesn't have any conflicts of interest in terms of financially. He's all about the research. It's his whole life. But to do that trial, they had funding from Beyond Meat. So someone could just go, dismiss that, was funded by Beyond Meat. But when you look at the methodology, it's as rigorous as it gets for a randomized controlled trial. But some studies that I've witnessed where it hasn't been done, so as you mentioned, the 33% of studies with a funding bias, really interesting. When I was looking at the Mediterranean diet, there were these two randomized controlled trials ran by the same academics who had received funding from the Pork Association and Dairy Association in Australia, and it's the Med Pork and Med Dairy trials. And what they did there was they got a group of people and told them to just continue eating their own diet. Another group of people, they told them to eat a Mediterranean diet, which is full of fresh fruits and vegetables, whole grains, olive oil, all associated with better health outcomes. But then they added a bit of pork in there. They added a bit of dairy. And so what they did there was they used the total diet as a sort of guise to promote the pork and the dairy. So it's little tricks like that when you're reading papers, you become aware of them and you can spot them out. Yeah. But not all industry-funded studies are like that.
Josh, it's interesting you should mention the swap meat trial, because I heard Christopher Gardner speaking about the techniques they use. And actually, he was saying to keep it as fair as possible, they used the best beef and meat products they could find, the organic, grass-fed, pasture-raised, all that sort of stuff. So actually, you're right. If you have got that scientific rigor and you want the results to mean, actually mean something truly representative of what you're...
And as she said, so that's the best meat you can possibly get, organic, whatever. And the Beyond Meat still beat it. And that study for me is really important, because what that shows is it's not just your textured vegetable proteins that are healthy, it's these more processed ones that are also better than your standard animal derived meats. So when people say these questions like, oh, but it's processed. Yes, it is a processed food, but compared to meat, it's still better for your risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So what does it matter that it's processed?
We really wanted to highlight that point because it's about comparing what you're eating compared to what you're replacing, isn't it? So on this podcast, we're not saying don't eat a bean burger. We're saying actually the studies that you've looked at show that whole food plant-based diet is better, but actually the processed vegan burger would be better than a meat burger, for example. So it's what you're comparing to, isn't it?
Absolutely. And so this, as I said and preface this research is with a lens of public health. This is thinking about everyone. Now, if you are someone that's incredibly health conscious and health literate, then yes, stay away from processed meat alternatives because they are not as healthy as a can of chickpeas or black beans or whatever it is that you'd be eating in replacement in a whole food plant-based diet. But for the average person that is eating burgers and chicken nuggets and all of these foods that are horrendous for your health, they are absolutely the better option.
That's so interesting.
I was just going to say, for more on making that point on whole foods versus meat substitutes, there's actually a Michael Grieger Nutritional Facts YouTube podcast that makes exactly those points in about 7 minutes. If anyone feels they haven't heard that enough, they are healthier, but not as healthy as the whole foods.
Great.
And so another really interesting thing that I find is the people that come for plant-based meats and say, they're processed and they contain these ingredients that you can't spell. Every food is made from chemicals. If you were to put the ingredient list of a banana or a beef burger, it would be lists of chemicals that 90% of people couldn't pronounce. So I just think people need to remove themselves from that dialogue of just, it's processed and has additives, therefore it's bad, because it's ridiculous. Everything's made from chemicals. And the chemicals that are in Beyond Meat and every other food are rigorously researched. The safety of food additives, it has to go through extensive trials. Now, they may not be associated with the best long-term health outcomes, but they are safe to eat.
Great. Josh, can we hone in a little bit on something that we read in one of your papers about heme iron and non-heme iron? Because I think both me and Claire always thought that all plant-based iron was non-heme, but we were interested in reading a little bit about the leg hemoglobin that Impossible Burgers are using, if I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, that is correct. So it's just a shortening of legume hemoglobin. So it naturally occurs in leguminous plants, so any sort of type of bean, and soy is one of them. And essentially, legumes have a very unique property, so they can fix nitrogen. So that's basically taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and putting it into amino acids. So that's the main source of amino acids in our entire food chain, I guess you could say, or life cycle of the planet. And so within the root nodules of leguminous plants, you have soy leg hemoglobin, and it facilitates the nitrogen fixation process. And so you will have, a lot of people have heard of hemoglobin before because we have it in our blood and it's involved in oxygen transport. And it's also in every mammal. And what you see when you look at the research is that heme iron sourced from animal foods is associated with increased risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, colorectal cancer, lung cancer, so lots of very detrimental health outcomes. And the concern is these leg hemoglobins are being used in some meat alternatives. So you have the Impossible Foods burger, which they're incorporating it because it has this meaty taste and aroma, which makes sense because that's what makes meat meaty is the blood. And so it works. It makes these products taste amazing, but there's the concern that it could be associated with the same long-term health issues as meat, which for me, I think so it would make switching to an Impossible burger more of a sideways move than a sort of a benefit, which for the environment, I would be all for it. I would still say let's all switch to them. But we don't actually have any research yet on even short-term health impacts of Impossible burgers. So that would be really cool to see in the next couple of years.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But do you think then, I guess there are some people who are making the switch to a more plant-based diet because of concerns with the environment, as you mentioned. Do you think we are going to enter a generation of having plant-based eaters who perhaps eat, too much processed food or unhealthy? Vegan donuts are everywhere. Vegan burgers are everywhere. The supermarket shelves are now full of alternative plant-based foods rather than actually going for the whole grains, whole foods, fruit, vegetables, that sort of thing. How do you see the future given the shift that we've seen in the supermarkets?
Yeah, so my line of research isn't necessarily looking at the health of vegans as such, but I have done a lot of reading on sort of like the EPIC cohort and a few other of the sort of British vegan cohorts. And it looks as though they're certainly not eating enough fibre, which then makes you think, what on earth are they eating if they're vegan and they don't have high fibre intakes? So yeah, as you said, they must be eating just junk food, really. And it is reflected by their health outcomes. They don't have the sort of significant improvements in cardiovascular disease risk that you'd expect. So I think when you look at the data, it's maybe a couple % less cardiovascular disease than the meat eaters, which you would expect massive differences, and even increased risk of stroke in this population. I think that's more of a concern around vitamin B12. And we really need people to focus their eating plant-based diets on taking a supplement regularly, getting their levels checked, because some people aren't able to absorb the vitamin B12 by a supplement and then they need a shot. So it's just incredibly important we check that out because it is associated with a long list of really negative health outcomes. But yeah, I am concerned with the health outcomes of vegans, but it doesn't appear that they are sort of at a much greater risk of disease than meat eaters. So I think that whole narrative of, oh, you're vegan, that's why you're sick, that doesn't really stand true, but we should be healthier. So yeah, it is important that we start eating more fruits and vegetables. That stands for everyone, vegans, omnivores, everyone should be eating more fruits and vegetables.
Absolutely. I mean, the way I see it is like, I think the majority of my diet is a whole food plant-based diet, but these burgers or meat alternatives are just great for, I don't know, people that are transitioning. Like Claire was telling you earlier, wasn't I? My son, he's a teenager, goes out with his friends. They're all eating at Nando's or whatever other place they're at, and they're all having a burger, and then he can join in and he can have the vegan burger. And that's great. And I think it just makes it so accessible for him to be part of, just part of his group and not feel left out.
And that is exactly where my study on psychological well-being comes in, because it's saying, hey, look, you don't have to be excluded now from all of those practices that you used to be, and all of the social events and the family drama. You can now integrate with people and eat the same thing as them, but it's just made from plants.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I really loved having a preview of what you were looking at with psychological effects of plant-based meat alternatives. There's been a lot of other studies out, haven't there, that have said that vegetarians and vegans are more depressed than people who eat meat. And so you've actually come up with something that takes us in another direction, which is great.
Yeah, so for what we did here, this is unreleased research, but it will be published soon. So you can have a little teaser here. You heard it here first, guys.
Wow.
So essentially what I did was a cross-sectional survey. So I used sort of convenience and snowball sampling. So I just used online social media to recruit people to this study. And I was just getting all kinds of people. I wasn't specifically looking at vegetarians or vegans. I was getting everyone, no matter what their dietary pattern. And we ended up getting over 1,000 respondents to this survey. And what the questions they were answering were what their diet was like and what they ate on a day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis. And then also some markers of psychological well-being. So we were looking at life satisfaction, risk of feeling depressed, and also general health and how happy they feel. And then we also collected data on sort of their demographic and socioeconomic status so that we could adjust and have a look if whether that was responsible for any patterns we saw. And what we saw when we looked at the whole sample was that there were no significant associations with life satisfaction or depression. It didn't look like there was much going on. There was positive correlations, but they weren't statistically significant, and that's what we're looking for. But then when you do a subgroup analysis and you just look at the vegetarians, and for whatever reason, I managed to recruit around 50% of the sample as vegetarians. And so when you just look at them, so these 500 vegetarians, there was a very clear, almost linear correlation with the amount of plant-based meats that they were eating and their life satisfaction, which is really interesting. And so, that my conclusion was that when you're eating a very strict vegan vegetarian diet and you're not eating meat anymore, you are sort of withdrawing from the norm and the status quo, and you are excluded. And that's bound to have a psychological impact. So including these meat alternatives into your diet will allow you to reintegrate back in and not feel so left out, and hence have a more satisfying life. And they're also really tasty. Remember, a lot of vegans go vegan because of ethical reasons or for the environment. That doesn't mean they don't love the taste of meat. And so regaining that satisfaction and enjoyment may also be contributing there. So I think that's fascinating. I think it goes to show that we should also be promoting plant-based meat alternatives to meat eaters as the switch, because clearly they are more achievable to stick to if they're more enjoyable to eat, and vegetarians are happier when they're eating them. So why wouldn't we tell them to switch to that? So I really think there's something there.
Yeah. So Daisy, in terms of satisfaction, will it be Bean Burger or Beyond Burger tonight?
Well, I hate to blow my own trumpet, but actually I do meatballs with red kidney beans, and my son actually prefers them to when I used to do meatballs. So I'm not sure that's a reflection of my cooking or just a brilliant recipe online.
So we are going to find out what actually you get some enjoyment from food-wise, Josh, because we're going to ask you, what are you having for dinner tonight?
Okay, so it is a Friday, so I may treat myself, but the current plan is to do a sort of bolognese with a mixture of like soy mince and also lentils. I like to mix the two together. I work out quite a bit, so I like the extra bit of protein. I also just do really like these products now. They are enjoyable to eat. And so I'll have like some whole grain pasta with that, and then a bunch of veggies, some fresh basil and herbs. And that'll be my meal.
Sounds good. I like that idea of mixing the two together. That's quite a good one, Claire. Do you ever do that?
I do. And we had it when Gemma was talking about her meal on the last episode, and she talked about combining, I think it was soya mince and lentils, adding a tin of lentils. And I said something like pack them in, because I really love the idea of doubling it up on that as well.
Sounds
great. It's a great way of sneaking them in for people that wouldn't usually eat lentils as well. They often don't even realise they're there.
Absolutely. How about you, Claire? What's for dinner tonight on your table?
Oh, so I'm going to have something I've already made, and it is actually better a sort of day later. It's not too original, but it's a chickpea, butternut squash, red pepper and apricot tagine. So it is, the butternut squash and the red pepper you pre-roast, and then you caramelize some red onions. So that just means cooking them for about 15 minutes, not burning them, but getting the sugar out of the onion, and then adding some garlic. And most of the flavour, but not all of it, comes from adding a good quantity of harissa paste. But you can also add in some extra cumin and some cinnamon as well, and some tinned tomatoes so that it's got a bit of a base, and leave that to kind of sit overnight so it all blends together nicely. And then just before I serve it, I'm going to put some kale in the oven. Kale, which you rub in a tiny bit of olive oil, add some salt, and then just do it for 5 or 6 minutes in a hot oven, and you get like this sort of crispy kale that you can serve on top of it. And until a few weeks ago, I wasn't eating quinoa at all, but there's something about keep talking about whole grains. I'm having it with quinoa.
Oh, nice. That's brilliant. Yeah. Sounds good. Very autumnal, I must say.
Yeah. So, Daisy, are you having your kidney bean burger? Was it kidney bean? What did you say?
It was the red kidney bean meatballs. No, but I tell you what I am having, which we've talked about off the podcast before. I finally managed to work out how to cook tempeh and actually enjoy it. Because Josh, I eat we as a family eat a lot of tofu, and that tends to be our meat replacement go-to.
Yeah.
It's just tofu with everything. But tempeh has always been one that I haven't been that fond of. until I learnt to just steam it. So I just steam it for about 5 minutes before I cook it. And it's just changed the whole thing completely. I love it now. I can't get enough of tempeh.
I'll have to give that a go, because I also am not that keen on tempeh.
Me neither.
Yeah,
but you've promised us a good taste, haven't you, with this steaming method?
Slice it, and then just put it I just put it in a shallow frying pan with some water, and just let it boil up like that for about 5 minutes while I'm prepping everything else. And then put that aside, obviously drain the water, put it aside, let it cool down. And that steaming, that boiling, I don't know, just changes the taste. It gets rid of the slight bitterness that tempeh has. And then you can do whatever you want with it. So the ingredients that I've got tonight are sort of oriental. So it'd be like soy sauce, miso, some lime, some ginger. And what I'll do with the tempeh, I've done this before, is just shred it. And you can do that with your hands, or you could just chop it up really finely. And it sort of does resemble a sort of a mince, I suppose. It's really, really fine, almost crumb-like, I suppose. And I'll fry that off, just a tiny bit of olive oil, and add the aromatics, the ginger and the garlic. And then I'll add my sort of soya miso paste sauce thing, and lime juice, and serve that with rice and broccoli. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Making me hungry.
That's what we always say. We love it, don't we? But go and get some hummus, Josh. That's my pre-lunch snack.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, just to wrap things up, Josh, it's been really wonderful chatting with you today. And I've learned a lot, because I was always worried, I suppose, with introducing people to processed vegan foods and but actually looking at your research, reading your papers, and knowing that there are health benefits with these more processed plant-based meats. And they're a good alternative for people who are transitioning or who want to have a burger once in a while. And particularly for my teenage son, he'll be very, very happy that you've given us the go-ahead for the odd vegan burger. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
It's been a pleasure to share my research with you. I'm very grateful for the platform to do so. And I will happily come on anytime. My PhD should get some interesting findings, so it'd be brilliant to come back on when I have them to discuss that.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, Josh. Bye.